Ladies and gentlemen, in 1932, when Lady Astor was in Russia, she told Stalin that Churchill was finished, a busted flush in Beaverbrook's words. Stalin didn't agree. He said, if the English are ever in trouble, they may need the old war horse again. And this is exactly what happened. Stalin's phrase was an appropriate one. Churchill somehow managed to carry this atmosphere of being an old warrior brought back into the field, and yet with it at the same time an almost youthful zest. He was, of course, much the most experienced of the warlords in the sense that he had been in politics a very long time. He'd been in the House of Commons on and off, though, from 1900. He became a cabinet minister as early as 1908. He had been at the head of almost every great department of state, except the Foreign Office. He knew how things worked. But he had also, of course, had long periods of failure. In the late 1930s, he was extremely unpopular, at any rate not rated highly. Indeed, in late 1938, he talked of retiring entirely from public life because he said, my career is a failure, it's finished, there is nothing more to offer. And then, surprisingly, as it were, with the coming of the Second World War, he was picked up again and began a new career, though a career which was enormously shaped by what had gone before. It was in May 1940, after the unsuccessful campaign in Norway, a campaign, ironically, for which Churchill was mainly responsible, and the failures of which were more due to him than to Chamberlain, the Prime Minister who was actually discredited. He became Prime Minister. But even then, it would be an exaggeration to say that his position was always secure. Nowadays, looking back, if we look back at all, we think of Churchill as the leader of a united nation which persisted wholeheartedly in the war from 1940 until 1945. That isn't how it seemed at the time. There was still, at any rate at the beginning in 1940, there was still a lot of disagreements under the surface. Many Conservative members of Parliament resented the way in which Chamberlain had been pushed aside. When Churchill first appeared in the House of Commons to make his famous speech about blood, toil, tears and sweat, he was cheered from the Labour benches only. The Conservatives remained silent until Chamberlain came in. And it was only some weeks later that an influential journalist warned that this was very bad and that it was giving a bad impression, spoke to Chamberlain, and the Conservative chief whip told off his chaps and at the signal of his handkerchief cheered Churchill, but it was still a cheer which sprang from calculation. It was not till much later in the day that Churchill became the undisputed leader of the country. Even then, often challenged, unlike Lloyd George, for instance, the First World War, Churchill actually had a vote of no confidence moved against him, and though only 25, this is July 1942, although only 25 MPs voted for it, there was a much wider spread of apprehension. Churchill had to be on his best behavior. He had to remember the failures of the past, failures which were due to his too great enterprise, to his enthusiasm for victory. He once said, when contemplating some risky course, remember, I have the medals of Antwerp, Gallipoli, Norway, and elsewhere pinned on my chest. In other words, though he couldn't resist these enterprises, yet he sometimes hung back in caution. He was undoubtedly a warlord. Technically, indeed, I think you could say that he commanded the greatest position. He was not a dictator, of course. He had arrived at his position in the ordinary constitutional way because the House of Commons had lost confidence in Chamberlain. He was made Prime Minister by King George VI, who at first was by no means eager to have him. He presided over a small war cabinet which was composed entirely of, I was going to say lesser men, certainly men who had less experience in government, and it's difficult to discover any really striking examples of the war cabinet itself pulling him back during the war. He also introduced an entirely new rank. He made himself Minister of Defense. What he said was that the changes were more real than apparent. By becoming Minister of Defence, he could exercise a completely undefined authority over the whole sphere of war. Moreover, a new institution which had never existed in British history before, and incidentally did not exist in most other countries, did not exist in Germany, for example. There was a Chiefs of Staff Committee combining the heads of the three services, which in theory at any rate directed the war. In practice, Churchill did a good deal of the direction himself. But though he had this tremendous position of being Prime Minister, Minister of Defence, dominant, so it seemed, in Parliament and in the country, and unmistakably the outstanding minister so far as public opinion went, everyone knew this was Churchill's government. He was the one person who mattered. It was only, shall we say, his death alone would have shattered public feeling. As long as he was there, things would be all right. Nevertheless, it's surprising how rarely he actually imposed his will on generals and chiefs of staff. He once said, the most delightful and characteristic phrase, "All I asked was compliance with my wishes after reasonable discussion." Now, it wasn't so much that he dictated, he ordered. He wore people down. He was himself inexhaustible. He could argue and argue, and a general or a chief of staff who was less ready to go on with these wearisome arguments till late at night would flag. But those who stood up to him were able, as, shall we say, Alan Brooke, the chief of the Imperial General Staff for much of the war, Alan Brooke was, though Alan Brooke expressed his exasperation in his private diary, never did so in public. And the same, I think, is true. There is one case, which I'll mention later, when Admiral Pound, who was the first Sea Lord, was driven into something that he hesitated about with disastrous consequences. But in a curious way, Churchill combined extreme impatience, a readiness to throw out new ideas. Hardly a day passed without his producing some idea for a new offensive. Roosevelt, who was a bit skeptical about him, said, you know, Winston has 100 ideas every day, and one of them is almost sure to be right. But he didn't mind. He produced another 99 the next day. He was sometimes, of course, cast down not so much by defeat, but when his own calculations and hopes had gone wrong. There were, after all, very gloomy periods. But predominantly, he would rise again with new ideas, with new enthusiasms the next day, and would, as all his associates agreed, he would carry them with him. He liked to think he was a tyrant. When someone said to him that Hitler bullied his generals, Churchill replied, "So do I." And if the generals were at all weak, yes, then he would turn them out. He had a long record, far greater, shall we say, than Lloyd George in the First World War, of dismissing generals who had failed, often when the failure was by no means their own fault. He sacked Wavell from command in North Africa, although Wavell was, I suppose, the most distinguished British general in the early days of the war. He sacked Auchinleck. Someone has calculated that at one time or another, he proposed to dismiss every one of the great admirals of the war, though he didn't succeed with all of them. He proposed at one time to sack Cunningham, Somerville, Forbes, the commander of the Home Fleet, Tovey, his successor, Harwood. It didn't always come off, but on the first moment of it wasn't disobedience. What he disliked was simple failure. He always had a faith that if he went on sacking long enough, something would come right. And in a sense it did, though it was for different reasons. Churchill's first great contribution was simply in ensuring that after the fall of France, the war would go on. At the time, the impression was given that everyone was united in this. We now know that in the secrecy of the cabinet in the last days of May 1940, the possibility of a negotiated peace with Mussolini as the mediator in the new Munich was seriously discussed in the War Cabinet and pressed, I can't say strongly because Halifax never did anything strongly, but at any rate pressed by Halifax. And even Chamberlain hesitated. It was the two Labour men, Attlee and Greenwood, who were firm on the other side, and Churchill who then guided it the other way and said, well, in any case, it would be impossible. The prospect of a negotiated peace, of a compromised peace, did not, I think, really disappear until after victory in the Battle of Britain. Incidentally, the Battle of Britain was, for this country, our country, the decisive battle of the war. It ensured that Great Britain would not be invaded. The Battle of Britain was won by Air Chief Marshal Sir Hugh Dowding. His conduct of the battle, his securing that the fighter command should be strong enough, the way in which he directed them with skill, with the assistance of his other air marshals, of course, won a battle which was as great, as decisive, and in a sense as glorious in our history as the Battle of Trafalgar. But at an earlier stage, Dowding had contradicted Churchill. He had opposed sending fighter squadrons to France. And the moment that the Battle of Britain was won, Dowding was turned aside. His achievements were never acknowledged. He alone was never given a title. He was never mentioned in honors because he had aroused Churchill's antagonism. There are others whom Churchill didn't forgive, but Dowding, I think, is the most striking. And it was the open going against him which Churchill couldn't like. Nevertheless, there are other things that Churchill decided. Broadly, British strategy in the Second World War, though no doubt it grew up from pre-war events and from the proposals of the chiefs of staff, broadly, British strategy in the Second World War was decided by Churchill in the last resort. He had a great, though not an unquestioning faith in bombing. Indeed, when strategical bombing of Germany started, it was largely for the reason, if we don't do this, there's nothing we can do. Remember, after all, that on any large scale, British and German troops did not fight, they certainly did not fight large battles between 1940 and 1943. For those 3 years, there was a pause, a war in theory more than in practice. And British bombing was one way to show that British were in the war. This was certainly sustained by Churchill, though he was readier than others to recognize that the bombing campaign did not achieve, in the end, all that it was said it would do. Strictly, one might say, bombing did not win the war unaided by land armies. But the second commitment was more characteristic and did more not only to shape the British pattern of war, but to absorb Churchill's attention, was the British commitment in the Mediterranean. Here again, it began in July 1940 on the very simple grounds there was nothing else to do. There was a British army in Egypt. The British had been turned out from the continent. How could they fight unless they stayed in Egypt? And if you ask what the Mediterranean campaign was about, why the British were ever in the Mediterranean, one can give the simple answer of the Second World War as of the First on some occasions. They were there because they were there, because they were there. And being there, then they better stay there and fight. One of Churchill's most courageous decisions was to send reinforcements out to the Mediterranean even before the Battle of Britain had finished. But once there, more and more British resources were drawn in. And it was not until 1944 that Great Britain was able to, or the British forces were able to return to the continent itself. There was a positive side to Churchill's interest in the Mediterranean. He had always been fascinated in it. For him, it represented, after all, the deepest legacy of imperial strategy as it had been followed from the time of Nelson to that of the First World War with its campaigns in Palestine and Mesopotamia. And he also continued to hold a belief which he had held in the First World War, which had inspired the expedition, the catastrophic expedition, as it turned out, to Gallipoli, that there was, from the Mediterranean, a back door into Europe. He sometimes referred to it as the soft underbelly of the Axis. It's very curious, because Churchill was a great one for maps. If he'd looked at any maps of the Mediterranean, he would have seen that the countries by which you would penetrate into Europe, either Italy or the Balkans, were not a soft underbelly at all. They were very hard, mountainous country. And we know as a fact that the combined British and American armies never managed to reach Germany from the south before the war ended. The Mediterranean campaign was much more a campaign against Italy, which was of no importance, than it was against Germany. But there was always this obsession, and the further belief that the Balkan countries, and Turkey too, were crying out to go to war against Germany, and that all they needed was a little encouragement from Great Britain. This belief was totally mistaken. Though it was essential, no doubt, to have a war in the Mediterranean in order to show that the British were still winning battles, and of course sometimes losing them, as a positive achievement towards turning strategy against Germany, it turned out to be disappointing. But this was Churchill's obsession, that he must do something, and he often snatched at historical examples, at historical tactics which had once been successful, which were now out of date. The curious thing about him is that he was both very historical, in the sense that he could look back. He had the great... I read the other day a description of just before the prospect in August 1940 that the Germans were about to invade, and some of his colleagues, not actually the chiefs of staff, gathered with him in the evening. He was sitting around drinking, and they thought he would discuss the problems of the German invasion, because he said, I want to discuss the problems of invasion. He then turned in detail to the invasion by William the Conqueror in 1066, and spent the entire evening discussing the problems which William faced and why the Anglo-Saxons, led by Harold, had failed. For him, in a sense, the problem of 1066 was as living as the problems of 1940, and he felt himself in the same continuity. History was part of his life. On the other hand, of course, he was also very up-to-date. He, after all, in the First World War, had initiated the tanks. Strangely, he didn't appreciate, I think, in the Second World War, the enormous transformations this had caused. He confessed himself about the French army in 1940. He had no idea that a decisive victory, such as the Germans achieved over the French, could be achieved with tank forces, although it initiated them. He took often time to catch up, and his very appearance presents this mixture of old and new. Sometimes he appeared in the House of Commons wearing a frock coat, a garment which otherwise had gone out, I suppose, with Edward VII. Sometimes he went around in a siren suit, rather like children's rompers. And with his baby face, he looked like an overgrown child bouncing around in rompers, and had the same exuberance of spirit. His phraseology was a mixture of high rhetoric and humor. His speeches sound better perhaps now than they did at the time, when they didn't always come across very well, but they were undoubtedly inspiring in the great days. The fact that he was always so alive brought inspiration to others also. He made many mistakes. All warlords make mistakes. Churchill's mistakes were the mistakes of hurrying too much, of wanting victory too soon, and wanting it with inadequate means. Historians still debate whether the expedition to Greece was a mistake in March, April 1941. It was certainly extremely unsuccessful. Other little ideas where he would send troops off and they would be lost sprang from this impetus, this impatience to do something. Nevertheless, on most of the great issues, though not on all, he was restrained. I suppose his greatest mistake was his refusal to take the dangers in the Far East seriously. And yet one might say he had to do this. If he had concentrated on the Far East before the Japanese went to war, then the Mediterranean might well have been lost. He says at one point that he didn't realize the weakness of Singapore. I ought to have asked. My advisors ought to have told me. Well, I'm sorry to say the records, as the records show, his advisors told him. And Churchill pushed it aside, again with a gesture of old imperial greatness, which was no longer relevant, when he said, the little yellow men will never dare to challenge the might of the British Empire. But in the autumn of 1941, the might of the British Empire in the Far East did not exist. At the last minute, he sent out a battleship and a battle cruiser to be what he called a vague menace. It's the one occasion, incidentally, when Admiral Pound was overruled. And this, too, was a catastrophe. The two ships were lost. The vague menace did not exist. It was Churchill, if he couldn't do something effective, he would want to do something ineffective. The one area in which he had little experience was, I think, in some ways, the area in which he was most successful. He had been everything except Foreign Secretary. But it was in his conduct of affairs with others, first with the smaller allies, his endless, no, not quite endless, his patience, sometimes hardly tried, by General de Gaulle, whom he referred to as my cross of Lorraine. Yet it was Churchill more than anyone else who kept de Gaulle going and secured that de Gaulle went back to a united, liberated France. But most of all, Churchill's cooperation, Churchill's linking up with the two great allies, the United States and Soviet Russia, were, I think, the highest points of his career and the one in which he was both most courageous and most creative. From the time when he became Prime Minister, all his thoughts were pinned on getting the Americans into the war. And he describes how at the time of Pearl Harbor, a catastrophe for the time being when the whole of the American fleet was destroyed, nevertheless, he said he slept peacefully because he realized now America had come into the war. And he ends his account of Pearl Harbor by saying, so we had won after all. He was absolutely clear from the moment the United States were allies that there would be, as indeed there was, total victory over the Axis powers. He exaggerated American generosity. For the United States, for Roosevelt himself, Great Britain was an essential element in strategy. But the Americans also had an exaggerated idea, which naturally they learned from Churchill himself, of the grandeur of the British Empire, and they were determined to squeeze it down. With the Russians, of course, it was the other way around. Churchill had been extremely anti-Bolshevik. He'd run the wars of intervention. Nevertheless, from the first moment when Soviet Russia was attacked, he committed himself wholeheartedly to the Russian side. People have argued that later on he was taking precautions against Soviet victory. I don't think so. He was apprehensive about Soviet victory, but right until the end of the war, he remained faithful to the Soviet alliance. He depicted, and it's too tempting not to read it, even though, as you'll see, I have difficulties about reading by having to take my glasses off. He depicted his relations between Soviet Russia and the United States at Tehran when he wrote this. There I sat with the great Russian bear on one side of me with paws outstretched, and on the other side the great American buffalo. And between the two sat the poor little English donkey, who was the only one who knew the right way home. Now that was a realistic judgment. Compared to Soviet Russia and the United States, Great Britain was perhaps a poor little English donkey, though an essential one, and incidentally, one must say, the only country, together with the Dominions, who carried the burden of war from beginning to end. Churchill imagined a great future for the British Empire, and yet, and this again was characteristic of him, the contradictions between grandeur and the visions of, or the recollections of the old empire and the realities of the present. In his first speech to the House of Commons after he was Prime Minister, he defined his policy as victory at all costs. And he made it, it was quite clear to him and to others at that time that he meant this victory even if the British Empire were to perish, victory even if we were to be an impoverished country. For him, I use another quote, as he said, "I have only one aim in life, that is to defeat Hitler, and that makes things very simple for me." And though he had other aims in life, as to preserve the British Empire, to preserve the conservative social structure in which he'd grown up, yet essentially they were eclipsed by the other thing, that whatever sacrifices were necessary for the war, he was ready to make and recognized that Great Britain should make them. His achievements on the positive side far eclipsed his failures. Even on the personal side, though he cleared away many generals, he raised up successful ones. Montgomery was not, in fact, an invention of his, and they, in the early days, worked uneasily together. But once Montgomery offered what no other generals, British generals, had offered until that time, victory, Churchill accepted this somewhat difficult personality. He continued at a time when his physical powers were lapsing. He still continued to survey the whole field of war, and I think even the most critical, looking back, would hesitate to say that anyone else could have taken his place in this strange people's war, this war of the worlds. There was this old-fashioned character with his cigar. Rarely, I may say, smoked. What Churchill did, in Beaverbrook's words, was to smoke matches. He lit a cigar, and you will see him always walking along with a cigar only just lit. But there was this combination of the profound strategist, the experienced man, and the actor, and not always a tragic actor. There was a rich comedy about him as well. And no other war leader, I think, has this same depth of personal fascination, that with Churchill, the interest is just as great when things are going wrong as when things are going right. One historian has called him, I think rightly, the savior of his country. And certainly his country recognized it. There have been two great war heroes in our history, Nelson and Wellington, both in their different ways, the saviors of their country. Churchill was added unto them because when he died, he was given a state funeral, which only Nelson and Wellington had had before. Incidentally, again, characteristic of him, he worked a great deal on the details of what was called Operation Hope Not. The final piece of the state funeral was unrehearsed. It was the lowering of the cranes. From there he was carried, his body was taken to Blaydon, put in a humble grave beside his father, and in this way he combined to the end imperial greatness and human simplicity.
Stay with us for another assessment from AJP Taylor. The Warlords series continues next on BBC4.